1878, Missouri, the funeral home with a secret maternity ward, the horrifying truth behind a baby trafficking ring. What if the hand that brought you into this world was the same one that signed your death certificate before you even had a name? In the mining town of Black Hollow, Missouri, nestled in the Ozark Mountains in 1878, two sisters controlled both the fragile beginnings of a life and the final rest of a soul. They ran the Blackwood Orphanage and Funeral Home, an institution respected throughout the land. But what they were truly building in the shadows, between the first cry of birth and the silent grave, was a legacy of crime so monstrous it was designed to be buried by time forever. This is not just a story about crime. This is the story of a town held captive by a monstrous secret hidden behind a veil of benevolence. The Blackwood sisters didn't just bury the town's tragedies, they created them, orchestrated them, and profited from them in the most ruthless way imaginable. They stole life from poor families and forged deaths to cover up a sophisticated human trafficking operation. This is the story of the Blackwood sisters and the truth of what happened within the walls that connected their two empires of life and death. But I must warn you, the path we are about to walk is not for the faint of heart. It demands that you question the very nature of kindness and cruelty, because this story will prove that the most terrifying darkness doesn't lurk in deserted alleys, but reigns in the very hearts admired by an entire community. If you are someone who doesn't just accept easy answers, if you believe that the truth, no matter how painful, must be brought to light, then you have come to the right place. Let me know you're ready by leaving a sign in the comments below. Let us know where in the world your flame of curiosity is lit. Together, we will turn the forgotten pages of history. Now, to truly understand the depravity of this decades-long crime, let's go back to Black Hollow, Missouri, in 1878. Now, to truly understand the depravity of this decades-long crime, I need you to picture the world as it was. Let's go back to Black Hollow, Missouri, in 1878. The Reconstruction era had just ended, and America was trying to heal its wounds. But in the remote valleys, isolated by the towering cliffs of the Ozarks, life moved to a different rhythm. Here, progress was a distant steam train whose whistle they only heard as an echo. Black Hollow was a town built on two things: coal and faith. It was a place where every face was familiar, where trust was not just given but assumed, especially when it came to people of status. The town doctor, the town pastor, the town undertaker. These were not just professions, they were pillars of the community. Their authority was as solid and unshakable as the mountains that enclosed them, cutting them off from the rest of the world. There was no second clinic, no other professional opinion to be found without a treacherous journey by horse-drawn carriage over muddy trails. The local newspaper, if one existed, reported on crops and church socials, not on the alarming infant mortality rate or the creeping tendrils of a systemic evil. This isolation was the perfect fertile ground for a moral sickness to grow. The people of Black Hollow were simple, hard-working folk, but they had been forged by generations of hardship to accept their lot in life, to place absolute trust in the educated, and to believe that some things, like the tragically frequent loss of a newborn, were simply God's will. They could never have imagined that this so-called God's will was actually a meticulously calculated human plan, orchestrated by the very individuals they entrusted with their most vulnerable moments. This backdrop of trust, isolation, and deference to authority is not just the setting for our story. It was the sharpest tool the perpetrators possessed. It was like an anesthetic, rendering the entire town oblivious as its very soul was being ravaged. Stepping into this tableau of quiet desperation and unshakable trust were the Blackwood sisters, Dr. Cordelia Blackwood and her younger sister, Prudence Blackwood. And I want you to truly picture these two women, because the public faces they wore were masterpieces of deception. Cordelia was the town's savior, an elegant, proper female doctor who had brought her medical knowledge back from the big city, a woman of great intellect and a gentle voice that could soothe even the most anxious mother-to-be. She spoke of her mission to bring modern medicine to these forgotten valleys, of giving the miners' children the same chance at survival as the children of prestigious families. She was a symbol of hope, a beacon of progress. She would hold mothers' hands, reassure husbands, and give health talks at the church. By all accounts, she was a saint in a pristine white coat. Then there was Prudence. Where Cordelia was the warm light, Prudence was the quiet shadow, and the town found that perfectly suited to her work. She was the operator of the orphanage and funeral home, silent, dignified, and always in a modest black dress. She managed the establishment with a solemnity that people found deeply comforting in their grief. She was seen as a sensitive, almost stoic soul, a woman who understood sorrow and gave the little departed souls a final place of rest. Together, they were the perfect pair, a seamless service for the beginning and end of young lives. Cordelia would deliver the babies, and in the tragic event that a child didn't survive, the impossibly convenient funeral home run by her own sister would handle everything privately and with dignity. No one saw this as a conflict of interest. How could they? In a town so small, it was seen as a blessing, a consolidation of difficult services under one compassionate family name. They were the beginning and the end in Black Hollow, and the town revered them for it. They were monsters hidden behind the most respectable masks imaginable. The sophistication of their evil, and I know that's a chilling phrase, lay in their cover story. It was so believable, so benevolent, that it made them virtually immune to suspicion. The Blackwood sisters didn't just run an orphanage. They established the Ozark Children's Future Fund. It was framed as a grand philanthropic endeavor. Dr. Cordelia Blackwood would give persuasive speeches at church gatherings, her voice filled with passion about her God-given mission to protect the community's most vulnerable. She would speak of a hereditary weakness she observed in the local population, a tragic consequence, she claimed, of generations of poverty and the harsh life of the coal mines. She argued that the high infant mortality rate, a sad but accepted fact in the region, was a crisis she was uniquely positioned to remedy. Her fund, she announced, would provide shelter, medical care, and a safe home for any orphaned or abandoned child. For the poor families who tragically lost a child shortly after birth, she promised to arrange a dignified burial on the church grounds, free of charge, as an act of charity. For the wealthier families in the area, the few who owned the mines or the largest farms, she offered a private, discreet adoption service, promising to bring them a healthy child to complete their family. This created a clever two-tiered system. To the poor, she was a charitable saint. To the wealthy, she was a purveyor of hope. But the masterstroke was how she explained the connection between her deliveries, the orphanage, and the funeral home. She claimed it was a circle of compassion. In the most tragic moments, she would say, her voice thick with feigned empathy, "An unfortunate child who passes is laid to rest in the arms of the Lord, and another child, left without a home, will find a new one." We are here to ensure that transition is seamless, dignified, and private, allowing families to grieve while bringing hope to others. It was brilliant. She took the most suspicious part of her entire operation, the flow of infants, and sold it as the most humanitarian of missions. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a philanthropist, a matchmaker of souls, a visionary. The town didn't just accept it, they celebrated it. They donated to her fund, they volunteered at the orphanage, they sang her praises. They were building her house of horrors on the foundation of their own goodwill. Now, let's talk about the physical space where this nightmare unfolded, because the very architecture of the place was a testament to their meticulous planning. Blackwood Manor was an old Victorian mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the town. From a distance, it exuded an air of dignity and respectability. Viewed from the main road, Blackwood Manor was divided into two distinct areas. The east wing was the orphanage, with its white-painted brick walls, large sunny windows, and a small charming garden. The west wing, with its grey stone facade covered in ivy and stained glass windows, was the funeral home. But this was a carefully constructed illusion. The true heart of the operation was a feature never spoken of, never shown on any blueprint, and known only to a select few: a damp, stone-reinforced underground corridor that connected the basement of the orphanage directly to the preparation room of the funeral home. The official explanation, whispered if anyone dared to ask, was that it was a passageway for moving supplies and, in the saddest of cases, for discreetly taking the bodies of children who died of illness, to spare the other children the grief. It sounded morbidly sensible, but I want you to truly visualize the reality of this. Imagine an orphan playing happily in the orphanage yard, while just a few dozen feet away, through thick stone walls and down a dark corridor, another life, another future, was being quietly ushered into the cold, chemical-scented air of the mortuary. The nursery section of the orphanage was also divided into two. There was the general area, where nurses and volunteers cared for the older children. And then there was the isolation ward, a place no one was allowed to enter except Dr. Cordelia and the head nurse. They said it was for the frailest newborns, those in need of special care. This hidden infrastructure, this sinister umbilical cord of stone and earth, was the assembly line for their horrific business. It allowed them to move infants, living or dead, between the two worlds they controlled with no witnesses, no records, and no questions asked. Of course, even in a town as isolated as Black Hollow, an unusually high number of infants dying or being abandoned at the same facility would eventually raise eyebrows. But Dr. Cordelia Blackwood had a chillingly effective and deeply insulting explanation for this. She took the very real hardships of the era and weaponized them. Whenever a healthy child was stolen from a poor miner's family, she would sit down with the heartbroken couple, her face a mask of profound sorrow, and explain the science behind their tragedy. She used terms they couldn't understand, but that sounded very learned. She would talk of innate frailty, the effects of coal dust on the mother's system, and hereditary bloodline degradation. She presented arguments supposedly from the latest medical studies, painting the Ozark region as a place where hardship had become ingrained in the very lineage of its people. In essence, she was blaming the victims, telling them that their poverty, their very blood, was the reason their child was too weak to survive. It was a eugenics-based argument, disguised as compassionate medical advice. For the wealthy families she targeted to sell the stolen children to, the explanation was different, but just as manipulative. She would tell a barren couple that, through the benevolence of a young mother who had tragically passed, they had the opportunity to adopt a healthy newborn. The paperwork would be handled discreetly and quickly, as a blessing from God. She would offer to handle all the details, including creating a plausible cover story, free of charge, as an act of charity. To the poor, she said their children were born destined to die. To the wealthy, she said they were destined to grant a child a new life. In both cases, she presented herself as the grieving but benevolent authority, the only one who truly understood the complex arrangements of fate. She created a narrative of tragedy and hope that the town, steeped in a culture of fatalism and reverence for its doctor, had no reason or ability to question. Her explanations were the perfect psychological cover for an unimaginable crime. An operation of this scale, this complexity, could not be run by just two women, no matter how clever. The Blackwood sisters needed an internal enforcer, a gatekeeper who knew the entire horrific system and was completely loyal. That person was head nurse Matilda Croft. To the public and most of the staff, Nurse Croft was the picture of discipline and devotion. She was the stern, unsmiling woman in her late 52nd who ran the orphanage with an iron fist. Her grey nurse's uniform was always crisp, and her sharp eyes seemed to see everything. She was known for her strict adherence to Dr. Cordelia's protocols, her harsh tone with any young nurse who dared to show weakness, and an almost fanatical obsession with order and cleanliness. Most people, including the young women who worked under her, were simply afraid of her. They attributed her severe demeanor to the weight of the job and the high standards she maintained. But her true role was far more sinister. Matilda Croft wasn't just an employee, she was an accomplice. We may never know if she truly believed Cordelia's twisted ideology, if she was bound by a dark secret from her past, or was simply motivated by a substantial cut of the profits. What we do know is that she was the critical linchpin. She was the one who managed the work schedules, ensuring only the most trusted were present during a planned event. She was the one who forged the birth and death certificates, her neat, cold script condemning infants to either a new, false life or an unmarked grave. She controlled access to the underground corridor and the isolation ward. She was the one who would soothe a grieving mother with strong sedatives, later explaining it as necessary care to ease the pain. She was the silent, ever-present warden of this infant prison. Her cold authority ensured the system ran smoothly, and that any potential witnesses among the staff were too intimidated or too misinformed to understand what they were seeing. She was the firewall of flesh and blood between the Blackwood sisters' monstrous secret and the outside world. To fully grasp the depravity of the Blackwoods business, we must identify the victims. And I need you to understand this because it is a critical part of the horror. There wasn't just one group of victims, there were three, each subjected to a unique and devastating form of violation. First, there were the mothers from the poorest mining families in the surrounding hollows. They were often young women, some still teenagers, who saw Dr. Cordelia as a savior. They placed their complete, unquestioning faith in the kind woman who promised to care for them and their babies. When they delivered a perfectly healthy, rosy-cheeked child, one that met the Blackwoods' desirable criteria for their clients, Nurse Croft and Dr. Cordelia would spring their trap. The mother would be given a strong dose of herbal sedatives, told it was to help her regain her strength. When she awoke, she would be given the devastating news that her baby had not survived, having been born too frail. Her grief was met with empty platitudes. Her questions were dismissed with complex medical jargon, and she was sent home empty-handed, with only the memory of a brief cry and a pain that would follow her for the rest of her life, while her child was alive and being prepared for a new life somewhere far away. The second group of victims were the very ones the Blackwood sisters needed to balance their criminal books. When a poor family did have a stillborn or sickly child, that body would be used. Prudence Blackwood, with a somber and dignified air, would arrange a charitable burial. A death certificate would then be created, but the name on it would be for a non-existent child, born and died on the same day. These fabricated deaths helped account for the growing number of infant graves in the town cemetery, quelling any suspicion about an unusual mortality rate. They turned real tragedies into tools to cover up larger crimes. Finally, the third and most tragic group of victims were the children themselves. The healthy infants stolen from their birth mothers were sold through a black market adoption network to wealthy, barren families across the country. These children grew up with no knowledge of their true origins. Their real families grieved a death that never happened. Their entire identities were built on a foundation of lies, a crime that stole not just a past, but the very truth of who they were. Every system, no matter how perfectly designed, eventually develops a crack. In the meticulously staged horror play at Blackwood Manor, that crack appeared in the form of a young woman named Clara Morrow. Clara was not a heroine seeking a crusade. She was just a young nurse, an orphan herself who had grown up on the kindness of others, and now she wanted to spend her life paying it forward. When she heard about the Blackwood Orphanage, a sanctuary for children like she had once been, it felt like a calling. She arrived in Black Hollow in the fall of 1878, full of idealism and compassion, deeply impressed by the elegant Dr. Cordelia and her noble mission. For the first few months, she saw nothing amiss. She fully believed the fabricated narrative. She pitied the frail babies and admired Nurse Croft's strictness, mistaking her coldness for necessary professionalism. The high mortality rate was sad, yes, but who was she, a young nurse, to question a doctor so revered by the town? The explanation of hereditary weakness in the region, while heartbreaking, seemed plausible to her young mind. The turning point, the moment the first crack appeared in her perception, was not dramatic. It was quiet and deeply disturbing. One night on a late shift, she was tending to a baby girl born just hours earlier to a young miner's wife. Clara had been present at the birth. The baby was robust, pink, with a loud, healthy cry. She had swaddled the infant herself, feeling the vibrant life in its tiny body. A few hours into her shift, Nurse Croft abruptly informed her that Dr. Cordelia had re-examined the child and discovered a serious, previously undetected respiratory issue. The baby was being moved to the isolation ward for special care. Clara was forbidden to go near. The next morning, Dr. Cordelia and Nurse Croft informed the young mother that her daughter had not made it. Clara stood at the end of the hall, watching the girl's world shatter, but something felt deeply wrong. She knew what a baby with a respiratory issue looked like, sounded like. This was not it. The silence, the speed, the way Nurse Croft avoided her gaze. It was a single discordant note in a symphony of feigned benevolence, and for the first time, Clara Morrow felt a cold knot of fear and suspicion tighten in her gut. The immediate aftermath was a period of intense psychological turmoil for Clara. What do you do when you suspect the unimaginable about people an entire town reveres? Who do you turn to in a place where authority is consolidated in the hands of the very people you suspect? Her first instinct was denial. She tried to convince herself she was wrong, that she was just a junior nurse misinterpreting a complex medical situation. She told herself that the fatigue and sadness of working in a place of tragedy were making her paranoid. Dr. Cordelia was a saint. Nurse Croft was just stern. The baby must have truly been weak. She tried to bury the memory, to focus on her work, to be the diligent, unquestioning nurse everyone expected her to be. But the image of that healthy baby, its vibrant cry silenced by a lie, haunted her. She would see the young mother sitting alone on a church pew, a ghost of a girl with hollow eyes, and guilt would gnaw at her. She started noticing other things, small inconsistencies she had previously dismissed. A set of infant clothes disappearing from the laundry, a name written in a duty log and then carelessly scratched out, and the smell of damp, musty earth that sometimes wafted up from the basement door that led to the private corridor. A smell she could not place. Fear paralyzed her. If she was right, she was in mortal danger. If she was wrong, she would be ruined, branded a hysterical, incompetent young woman, and cast out of Blackwood Manor, her nursing career and her only sanctuary over before it had even begun. For weeks, she lived in a state of silent terror, her diligent demeanor a fragile mask hiding a mind racing with suspicion. She would startle at the sound of Nurse Croft's rustling skirts behind her in the hallway and feel the constant, unnerving sensation of being watched. Denial was a desperate act of self-preservation, but the truth, once glimpsed, is a stubborn thing. It festered inside her, a poison that would eventually force her to choose between her own safety and the horrifying possibility that children were being stolen right under this roof. After weeks of wrestling with her conscience, Clara decided she couldn't live with the uncertainty. She had to know, but she knew a direct accusation would be a death sentence for her, professionally and perhaps physically. She decided to approach the one person in Black Hollow who supposedly embodied morality and justice, the town pastor, an older man named Father Thomas, who was more accustomed to comforting grieving souls than confronting earthly conspiracies. She waited for him after the Sunday morning service, her heart pounding in her chest, and anxiously explained her concerns in the confessional. She didn't make a wild accusation. She framed it as a worried confession, a plea for guidance from a young nurse troubled by some irregularities in the orphanage ledgers and the tragic fate of so many newborns. She spoke of the baby with the sudden respiratory issue, of the mysteriously disappearing baby clothes. Father Thomas listened, but his expression shifted from pastoral concern to weary dismissal. He knew the Blackwood sisters. They were the church's biggest benefactors. Cordelia had cured his wife's rheumatism last winter. The idea that these women, these pillars of the community, could be involved in anything criminal was, to him, utterly preposterous. He laid a hand on her shoulder and explained it away with classic blind faith. "Now, my child," he said, his tone patronizing, "Dr. Cordelia is one of the kindest women God has given us. Running an orphanage in a place like this, it is a great burden. The children who come here, bless their hearts. They often carry the sickness of poverty with them. It is a tragedy, but it is not a crime. You're likely just overworked, child." He promised to pray for her and to have a private word with Cordelia, but Clara knew what that meant. He would tell the doctor that a new nurse was having paranoid thoughts, and Cordelia would know exactly who it was. The system was protecting itself. The pastor wasn't an evil man. He was simply a product of his environment, incapable of imagining an evil that wore such a virtuous face. Clara left the church with a new, colder, and more terrifying realization. She was utterly, completely alone. The path of faith wasn't just closed, it was part of the wall of silence. Clara's failed attempt to find help had a chilling effect. She was a marked woman now. Nurse Croft's already icy demeanor toward her became openly hostile, assigning her the most grueling and dirty tasks, isolating her from the other nurses, her hawkish eyes tracking Clara's every move. Doctor Cordelia, on the other hand, became even sweeter, often pulling her aside to ask how she was feeling. her gentle concern now feeling like a veiled threat. But the fear that was meant to silence her forged a grim determination. She realized the only evidence that could expose the Blackwoods lay not in her testimony, but in the living truth of their crimes. She started thinking about the other side of the equation. If healthy babies from poor families were disappearing, where were they going? This led her to a horrifying but logical conclusion. They were being sold. This meant that somewhere out there, children were living under false names with families who had no idea their beloved child was a stolen life. But how could she prove it? The answer, she realized, might lie in the clues left behind. With no newspaper or public library in Black Hollow, Clara had to find another source of information. She began a secret, painstaking process of reviewing old church ledgers, which recorded baptisms, and cross-referencing them with the funeral home's burial registry, which she could only glimpse for fleeting moments when Prudence was away. It was slow, terrifying work, done by flickering candlelight late at night in her workroom. She began to see a pattern. A child recorded as having died of frailty in the funeral home's book, but with no record of its baptism in the church register. Conversely, children recorded as having been adopted at the orphanage had no birth certificates or records of their origins. The paper trail, as deliberately scrambled as it was there. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Clara began to notice the small items that poor mothers, in their grief, had left to be buried with their babies. A hand-knitted bracelet, a piece of an embroidered blanket. She remembered these items vividly. Weeks later, while cleaning the rooms of newly adopted children, she was horrified to discover those exact same items, the bracelet, the blanket piece tucked away in the belongings of living children. The stolen victims, the ones buried under a lie, and the ones living a lie, were the living proof. Each mismatched detail, each misplaced item, was a ghost screaming a truth no one else could hear. She now knew she wasn't just investigating suspicious deaths. She was uncovering a vast, complex market in human lives. As Clara dug deeper, risking her life with every foray into the records room and every stolen glance at the orphanage's private books, she began to piece together the monstrous ideology that served as the philosophical foundation for the Blackwood sisters' crimes. This wasn't just about money. That was a significant part of it, of course, but at its core, this was about Dr. Cordelia Blackwood's God complex. In a locked wooden chest under the bed in Cordelia's private bedroom, a chest she managed to pry open one terrifying night with a hairpin, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. She didn't find a simple ledger of transactions. She found something far more disturbing, a series of leather-bound journals. In these journals, written in a neat, elegant script, Cordelia laid out her entire worldview. She did not see herself as a criminal, but as a visionary, a pioneer in what she called social purification and bloodline preservation. She believed the Ozark mining folk were genetically degraded, trapped in a cycle of poverty and sickness, a drag on the progress of society. She wrote that she was performing a sacred service by taking healthy newborns from mothers she deemed unfit, who would only pass on their weakness to the next generation. She was rescuing them, giving them a chance at a superior life with wealthy, moral families who could provide them every advantage. She saw it as a form of humane gardening, pruning the diseased branches of the human family tree. The stillborn or genuinely sick children of the poor were, in her mind, nature's errors, and she was simply cleaning them up. The fraudulent death certificates and fake adoption papers were necessary tools, a means to a higher end. She documented her cases with cold, scientific detachment, noting the physical traits of the stolen babies, hair color, eye color, health as if they were prized seeds. She was matching them to the requests of her benefactors. She wasn't just stealing babies. She was curating a generation, playing God with her medical knowledge, the community's trust, and a fountain pen, all from her small, isolated kingdom in the hills of Missouri. Our story to this point has been one of deepening shadows, of a seemingly perfect crime carried out by untouchable villains. But every great evil eventually summons its own opposition, and in this story, the unlikely hero was the very person they had underestimated the most. Let's talk more about Clara Morrow. I want you to truly understand who she was, because her courage was born not of strength, but of deep vulnerability. She was not a hard-boiled detective or a seasoned investigator. She was a quiet, observant young woman, an orphan raised to be grateful and to believe in the kindness of others. The world of Black Hollow, with its dark undercurrents and conspiracies, was completely alien to her. Her heroism was not a single act of bravery, but a slow, painful process of overcoming her own fear. Imagine the terror of lying in her narrow bed in her small attic room, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, wondering if the Blackwood sisters knew what she was doing, wondering if the friendly blacksmith she'd greeted that morning had reported her questions to them, wondering if Father Thomas's benevolent smile was a warning. Every day at the orphanage was a performance. She had to smile at Dr. Cordelia, take orders from Nurse Croft, and care for the children, all while carrying the weight of a secret that could get her killed. Her courage was in the small things, the decision to check one more ledger, the nerve to stay up late by candlelight, the resolve not to run but to see it through. She was driven by an intense, almost primal sense of justice, a feeling deeply connected to her own past. She knew the value of a home, and she saw homes being ruthlessly stolen. She was the one conscience not lulled to sleep by the town's culture of deference and blind faith. She was ordinary, which is precisely what made her extraordinary. Her journey was not about power or might. It was about a single, frightened person deciding that the truth was worth fighting for, even if it meant she would have to fight completely alone. Clara knew that her suspicions and even the misplaced baby items were not enough. She needed irrefutable proof, something that connected the missing babies to the new adopted families, something that couldn't be explained away by Dr. Cordelia's benevolent voice. Her investigation from within the orphanage became a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. She had to operate right under the noses of her tormentors. She began volunteering for the most undesirable tasks, cleaning out the dusty old storerooms, reorganizing the paper archives, scrubbing the damp basement. She framed it as the diligence of a grateful orphan girl, eager to please those who had taken her in. In reality, she was searching. She knew there had to be a ledger, a record of the transactions. A woman as meticulous and arrogant as Cordelia Blackwood would surely keep a detailed account of her achievements. Her search became an obsession. During her rare moments of downtime, she wouldn't rest. Instead, she would find a secluded corner of the mansion to study its layout, looking for hidden spaces, unusually thick walls, or loose floorboards. She memorized the schedules of the other staff, figuring out the precise windows of time when she could be alone in Cordelia's office or Prudence's preparation room. Constant fear was her unwanted companion. The soft footfalls of Nurse Croft in the hallway would send a chill down her spine. An unexpected trip to the basement by Prudence to check supplies would force her to hide behind old chests, holding her breath, praying she wouldn't be discovered. It was a psychological war. They were watching her. She knew it, but they still saw her as a naive young girl, perhaps a bit nosy, but not a real threat conducting a clandestine operation in their midst. This underestimation was her only shield. She was mapping their fortress from the inside, learning its routines, its secrets, and its weak points, all while pretending to be nothing more than a simple, obedient orphan girl. The breakthrough came on a late autumn night in 1878. A fierce storm rolled in from the mountains, plunging Black Hollow and Blackwood Manor into a deep darkness. It was the chance Clara had been praying for. With the staff distracted by lighting oil lamps and the chaos of the storm, and with Dr. Cordelia called away by carriage to help a miner's family with an injury from a rockslide, Clara knew it was now or never. Her target was Prudence Blackwood's private office within the funeral home, a place she had never dared to go. She used the excuse of checking the windows in the west wing to make sure they were latched, a lie that sounded thin even to her own ears. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped through the underground corridor and into the cold, silent world of the mortuary. The air was thick with the pine wood scent of coffins and damp earth. Using only a small candle, she found her way to Prudence's office. It was impeccably neat, just like the woman herself. Clara searched the desk, the drawers, everywhere. Nothing. Desperation began to creep in. Then her candlelight fell on something odd. A floorboard beneath the old Persian rug seemed slightly raised, not flush with the others. Her trembling fingers pried the board up, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Inside, nestled beneath some old jewelry, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. Her flickering candle illuminated columns of dates, infants' initials, some of which she recognized from the orphanage, and corresponding figures and locations. W. Family, St. Louis, $200 gold. P. Family, Kansas City, cash received via courier. Some entries even had notes. Good health, blue eyes, and most horrifying of all, tucked between the pages, were tiny locks of hair, carefully tied with ribbon. It was all there. The hard, irrefutable proof. Initials, dates, gold coin. It was the Blackwood sisters' entire criminal empire, chronicled in Prudence's meticulous hand. Clara knew she couldn't just take the ledger. They would know immediately it was her, and she would never leave Black Hollow alive. She had to get it to the authorities, real authorities, probably the state marshals in Springfield, a long ride away. In that moment, a plan born of pure adrenaline and terror formed in her mind. She would take the ledger, run, and pray she could make it through the treacherous Ozark wilderness before they realized she was gone. She wrapped the heavy book in a shawl, stuffed it in her satchel, and slipped back through the underground corridor, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She did not go back to her room. She didn't grab any belongings. She went straight out the back service door into the raging storm and ran for the stables. The rain and wind were a godsend, masking her escape. But as she was struggling to lead a horse out, the light from a lantern cut through the darkness, pinning her in its beam. Holding it was none other than Nurse Croft. And standing behind her, her face a mask of cold ice, was Prudence Blackwood. In an instant, Clara knew that Nurse Croft was not just an obeyer of orders. She was an active part of their network, their eyes and ears. The chase was on. Clara jerked the reins, leaped onto the horse's bare back, and spurred it out of the stable. She plunged into the dark, dangerous woods bordering the estate. What followed was a nightmarish chase through the Ozark forest in the middle of a thunderstorm. Prudence and a farmhand were on her tail, the sound of their horses and their angry shouts echoing in the wind. She was riding for her life, clutching the evidence that was her only hope. She rode low over the horse's back, dodging branches that whipped at her face, crashing through brambles that tore at her dress and skin, fueled by a terror so profound it eclipsed all pain and exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, the hoofbeats of her pursuers faded as they diverted their search down a false trail. Clara kept riding, deeper into the woods. She didn't dare stop until the horse was exhausted and the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the canopy. Soaked, freezing, scratched and bruised, but still clutching the ledger, she finally dismounted. She knew following any known road was a risk, so she continued on foot, leading the horse through the wilderness, using the rising sun to guide her northeast towards Springfield. It was a grueling journey that lasted nearly 2 days. She had no food but a few wild berries, no water but what she could scoop from streams. But the fear of capture was a more powerful motivator than any physical need. Late in the afternoon of the second day, she staggered out of the tree line and onto a dirt track leading to a small farm. A kind farmer, astonished by her disheveled appearance, was quick to show concern. She didn't tell him the whole story. She only said she was on her way to visit a sick relative in Springfield and had gotten lost. He looked at the sheer terror in her eyes, gave her a meal, and showed her the safest road to continue. The ride on his wagon out to the main road was the first moment she felt a flicker of hope. When she reached Springfield, she wasted no time. She sold the horse for a few dollars, then walked straight to the office of the state marshal. She placed the mud-stained ledger on the chief marshal's desk and said in a raw, hoarse voice, "My name is Clara Morrow. I'm a nurse from Black Hollow, and I have proof of unspeakable crimes against Dr. Cordelia Blackwood and her sister, Prudence." At first, the marshals were skeptical. The Blackwood sisters were, after all, reputable figures known for their charity. But the ledger was undeniable. The meticulous records, the initials that could be cross-referenced with church registries, and the chilling locks of infant hair were all there. The chief marshal's initial disbelief quickly turned to stunned horror. Within hours, a major investigation was launched. A secret task force assembled, far from the prying eyes and influence of Black Hollow's powerful friends. For the first time, Clara was no longer alone. The wheels of justice she had tried to turn by herself were finally, belatedly, set in motion. The reversal was staggering. The hunted had become the hunter. The raid on Blackwood Manor was planned with the secrecy and precision of a military operation. In the pre-dawn hours of a cold winter morning, a posse of state marshals rode into the sleeping town of Black Hollow. They blockaded the single road leading up to the mansion before anyone knew what was happening. The main raiding party, with Clara Morrow voluntarily accompanying them to guide the way, stormed the old mansion. What they found inside was worse than even the ledger had suggested. The orphanage and funeral home were not just a business of feigned compassion, they were a purpose-built facility for human trafficking. The isolation ward was, in fact, a holding pen, with thickly padded cribs to muffle the sound of crying. In the underground corridor, they found sedatives, carefully hidden caches of expensive baby clothes, and small toys that Clara recognized as belonging to children who had been reported deceased. But the true room of horrors lay in the basement of the funeral home. Behind a false stone wall in the preparation room, they discovered a hidden ice cellar. Inside, on stone shelves, were the tiny, nameless bodies of more than a dozen infants, preserved in ice. These were the tools of their trade. The genuinely stillborn or sick babies from poor families that they kept in order to stage fake deaths, to account for the growing number of infant graves in the cemetery. It was a gruesome library of stolen tragedies, a discovery so vile that several of the seasoned marshals had to turn away in silence. The raid exposed the physical reality of the Blackwoods crimes in the most horrific way possible, transforming their respectable mansion into the scene of one of the most monstrous crimes in the state's history. The unmasking of the Blackwood sisters sent a shockwave of horror and disbelief through Black Hollow and the entire region. These two women, who had been seen as community saints, were revealed to be monsters of almost unimaginable cruelty. Dr. Cordelia Blackwood, the elegant savior, was arrested in her office, reportedly remaining calm and arrogant to the very end. She did not confess. Instead, she tried to spin a narrative that she was engaged in a grand, misunderstood mission of social purification, that she was saving children from a life of squalor. She maintained her delusion of intellectual and moral superiority, viewing her captors as too small-minded to understand her work. Her journals, however, painted a clear picture of a narcissist with a god complex. Prudence Blackwood, the quiet, dignified operator, had a different reaction. When the marshals stormed the funeral home, Prudence retreated to her office, the very one where Clara had found the ledger. Before they could reach her, Prudence used a potent dose of poison, which she had kept for just such an occasion, to take her own life. She chose death amidst the tools of her horrific trade rather than face justice. Her final act was one of cowardice, a silent confession that left her sister Cordelia to face the consequences alone. The news shattered the town's collective identity. The people of Black Hollow were forced to confront a terrifying reality. Their trust had been weaponized against them. The hands they had trusted, the woman who had delivered their children, the solemn figure who had comforted them in their grief. It was all a lie. The pain was immense, but it was a complex pain, mixed with shame, guilt, and a gnawing, unanswerable question. How could we not have known? The masks had fallen, and the faces beneath were more terrifying than any fictional monster. The investigation following the raid revealed Blackwood Manor as the hub of a sophisticated infant trafficking network, unlocked by the key of Clara's ledger. This underground railroad of stolen children involved brokers in major cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, who took orders for babies with specific traits, with prices paid in gold and cash through discreet couriers. This enterprise, however, responsible for the fate of dozens of children, thrived not just on criminal ingenuity, but on a conspiracy of silence in Black Hollow, where blind faith and a collective refusal to accept a monstrous truth allowed every suspicion to be buried. While grim justice was eventually served, Cordelia died in prison, Prudence took her own life, and Nurse Croft vanished without a trace. The true resolution of the story remains incomplete. The heroine, Clara Morrow, was so traumatized that she lived out her days in haunted seclusion. The ultimate tragedy, however, belongs to the victims, the deceived, grieving mothers, and the countless stolen children, now adults, left as living ghosts. Their identities were a fabrication, and their true origins were forever severed. The legacy of the Blackwood sisters is more than just a chilling true crime story. It is a profound and enduring cautionary tale. It serves as a stark reminder of the terrifying fragility that exists at the intersection of birth and death, our two most fundamental human experiences. It shows how the power of institutions, especially medical and religious authority, can be so easily twisted into a tool for unimaginable evil when left unchecked by skepticism and oversight. In an isolated community like Black Hollow, the sisters' combined control over deliveries, the orphanage, and the funeral home created a perfectly closed system of exploitation, a place where they could literally create a tragedy and then profit from solving it with no one questioning the process. The lesson of this story is a deeply unsettling one. It is about the danger of blind faith and the seductive power of a benevolent face. Cordelia Blackwood was not a cackling witch. She was an elegant doctor, a benevolent savior. Evil isn't obvious. It is cloaked in charity, learned words, and sympathetic gestures. If this story chilled you to the bone and made you think, then help our community of investigators grow. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the darkness, and share this video with someone you think is brave enough to face it. See you in the next video, where we will uncover another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about American history. It involves a beloved national organization, a series of convenient deaths, and a cover-up that goes all the way to the top. You won't want to miss it.